What if the lowest moment of your life was actually the key to an unimaginable fortune? A freezing night, a homeless mother living in her car inherited a worthless, rotting mountain cabin, but what she found hidden beneath its floorboards would change her life and rewrite history forever. Listen closely. The heater in the old Honda Civic had finally given out. Surrendering to the brutal mountain freeze of Asheville, North Carolina, Sloane Simmons pulled the thin, scratchy thrift store sleeping bag tighter around her young son, Finn. He shivered in his sleep, his small breaths puffing into white clouds in the ambient glow of a distant Walmart parking lot light. Sloane stared at the frost creeping across the inside of the windshield, her eyes burning with unshed tears. She was in her early 30s, a widow, and utterly destitute. Earlier, her husband, Ryan, had been diagnosed with an aggressive lymphoma. The treatments at Mission Hospital had drained their savings, then their credit, and finally, their home. When Ryan passed away, Sloane was left with a mountain of medical debt and no safety net. Eviction had followed swiftly. For recent months, the Civic had been their living room, kitchen, and bedroom. Sloane survived by picking up shifts cleaning a local diner off Interstate 40, but the few crumpled bills she earned barely covered gasoline and cheap groceries. The morning after the heater died, Sloane made her bi-weekly trip to the local post office to check her P.O. box, the last tether she had to a permanent identity. Usually the box held nothing but final notices from collection agencies, but today, nestled among the brightly colored junk mail, was a thick, cream-colored envelope made of heavy cardstock. The return address read, Langford and Hayes, Attorneys at Law. Sloane's heart hammered against her ribs. She tore the envelope open with trembling, calloused fingers. The letter was typed in crisp, formal font. Dear Mrs. Simmons, we are writing to inform you of the passing of your maternal grandmother, Eleanor Hargrove. As her only surviving blood relative, you have been named the sole beneficiary of her estate, which includes the property located at Oak Haven Ridge Road in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Sloane stopped reading, her breath catching in her throat. Grandma Eleanor. Sloane had not seen her grandmother in years. Eleanor had always been the eccentric outcast of the family, a fierce, reclusive woman who chose to live off the grid in a remote mountain shack far away from modern society. Sloane's mother used to say Eleanor was dirt poor and crazy, hoarding tin cans and refusing to trust banks. Sloane looked at Finn, who was quietly eating a stale granola bar in the passenger seat. They had nowhere else to go. A house, even a run-down cabin, was a roof. It was walls. It was shelter from the biting winter wind. Scraping together the last of her diner tips, Sloane filled the Civic's tank and drove out of the city. The journey up Oak Haven Ridge was treacherous. The paved highway gave way to gravel, and then to a deeply rutted dirt road that wound through dense, skeletal pine forests. The Civic's tires spun and slipped on the icy mud, the engine whining in protest as they climbed higher into the desolate mountains. Finally, the trees parted to reveal a clearing. Sloane threw the car into park and stepped out into the freezing mountain air, her heart sinking like a stone. The estate was a tragedy of rotting timber. The cabin leaned heavily to the left, its porch sagging under the weight of decades of neglect. A blue plastic tarp, faded and shredded by the wind, covered half of the roof. The front yard was a graveyard of rusted metal, an old tractor axle, piles of decaying firewood, and a rusted-out Ford pickup truck sinking into the weeds. "Is this our new house, Mom?" Finn asked softly, stepping out of the car and clutching his threadbare stuffed bear. Sloane swallowed the lump of utter despair in her throat. She had hoped, just for a second, that maybe her mother had been wrong. Maybe Eleanor had possessed a cozy little cottage. But looking at the dilapidated shack, Sloane realized this was not a rescue. It was just a different kind of poverty. "Yes, baby." Sloane forced a smile, pushing open the rusted iron gate that shrieked on its hinges. "It is going to be a grand adventure. Let us go inside." The interior was even worse. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, dust, and old wood ash. There was no electricity, no running water, just an old cast-iron wood stove in the center of the main room, surrounded by leaning towers of old newspapers, mason jars, and bizarrely, Dozens of heavy rocks lined up on the dusty shelves. It was a hoarder's nest. Sloane spent the first few hours in a frantic state of survival mode. She found some dry wood stacked on the back porch, and using an old box of matches she kept in the car, managed to get a fire roaring in the iron stove. The heat slowly pushed back the bitter mountain chill. She laid out their sleeping bags on the least dusty patch of the wooden floor, pulling Finn close to her chest as the wind howled through the gaps in the window panes. As the sun dipped below the tree line, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness, Sloane stared at the glowing embers in the stove. She felt entirely defeated. She had dragged her son out to the middle of nowhere to freeze in a rotting wooden box. But as the night wore on, a strange, persistent creak echoed from the floorboards beneath her. She chalked it up to the house settling in the cold. She had no idea that the very wood she was sleeping on was hiding a secret that people were willing to kill for. A pale, icy light broke over Oak Haven Ridge. Sloane woke up stiff and aching, the fire in the stove having died down to a faint orange glow. She was in the middle of boiling water in a dented aluminum pot over the embers to make instant oatmeal for Finn when she heard it, the crunch of heavy tires on gravel. Sloane froze. No one had come up this mountain road in years, judging by the overgrowth. She peeked through the grime-caked front window. A sleek, spotless black Cadillac Escalade had pulled into the overgrown driveway, looking absurdly out of place, next to Sloane's rusted Civic and the rotting Ford. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. He was in his late 50s, wearing a tailored charcoal wool overcoat and expensive leather loafers that immediately sank into the mountain mud. He looked at the cabin with an expression of profound disgust before pasting on a brilliant, entirely fake smile. Sloane told Finn to stay in his sleeping bag, grabbed a heavy iron fireplace poker just in case, and stepped out onto the sagging porch. "Mrs. Simmons?" the man called out, his voice smooth and carrying a subtle, polished southern drawl. "My name is Damian Prescott. I represent the Blue Ridge Preservation Trust." Sloane gripped the poker behind her leg. "How did you know I was here?" "Word travels fast in the county clerk's office," Prescott said, carefully navigating the junk in the yard to approach the porch. "I was sorry to hear about Eleanor. She was a stubborn fixture of this mountain, but I am here because my firm has been trying to purchase this parcel of land for years to add to the state's protected greenbelt." He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his eyes flicking over Sloane's frayed coat and the visible exhaustion on her face. A predatory gleam flashed in his pale blue eyes. He was assessing her desperation. "I will be entirely upfront with you, Mrs. Simmons," Prescott continued, pulling a sleek leather folio from under his arm. "This property is a liability. The structure is condemned, there are unpaid back taxes, and the soil is completely unsuitable for farming. But the trust is willing to take it off your hands today. I am authorized to offer you $25,000 cash. We can drive down to the notary in town right now." Sloane's breath hitched. $25,000. It was more money than she had seen in years. It meant an apartment. It meant hot showers, new clothes for Finn, and a warm bed. It meant leaving this nightmare behind. She opened her mouth to say yes, but a sudden sharp instinct made her pause. Why was a man in a $3,000 suit driving up a dangerous icy mountain road the exact day after the deed transferred to her name? And why was he offering cash for land he just claimed was worthless? $25,000, Sloane repeated slowly. Prescott smiled, sensing victory. "It is a generous offer for a condemned lot. We just want to preserve the natural beauty up here, and frankly, a woman in your situation could surely use the fresh start." "If it is just for a conservation greenbelt," Sloane asked, her voice steadying, "why the rush? Why the cash offer before I have even spent a full day on the property?" Prescott's smile tightened slightly, the mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "Bureaucracy, Mrs. Simmons. Our funding window closes at the end of the year. If we do not secure the land now, the funds evaporate. Besides, with the mineral rights on this ridge being so heavily restricted by the state, nobody else is going to buy it." Mineral rights. The words hung in the freezing air. Why would he mention mineral rights if this was about trees and conservation? "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Prescott," Sloane said, her grip on the iron poker tightening. "But my grandmother just died. I need a few days to sort through her things before I make any decisions about selling. Prescott's polite veneer vanished, his jaw clenched, and he took half a step up the wooden stairs. Mrs. Simmons, I strongly advise you to take the deal. This mountain is no place for a single mother and a child. Things up here, they decay quickly. It would be a shame to see you lose the property to tax foreclosure. I said I need a few days, Sloane said loudly, stepping forward, the iron poker now clearly visible at her side. Prescott stared at the iron rod, then back at Sloane's fierce protective glare. He scoffed, adjusting his wool coat. I will give you a brief window, but the price drops to $20,000 tomorrow. He turned on his heel, trudged back through the mud, and sped off down the mountain road, his tires kicking up a spray of dirt. Sloane stood on the porch, her heart pounding against her ribs. She went back inside and locked the flimsy deadbolt. Finn was sitting up, looking worried. Is that man taking our house? No, sweetie, Sloane said, her mind racing. Nobody is taking anything from us. She looked around the cluttered, filthy room. Eleanor had lived in absolute squalor, yet a corporate suit was desperate to buy the land. Prescott had mentioned mineral rights. Sloane remembered the strange rocks Eleanor had lined up on the shelves, heavy, dense stones with streaks of dark, shimmering grey. Sloane walked over to the nearest shelf and picked one up. It was incredibly heavy for its size. She remembered her mother's stories. Eleanor's husband, Sloane's grandfather, had been a wildcat miner in the 50s. He had died in a tunnel collapse somewhere in the Appalachians, leaving Eleanor to descend into reclusive paranoia. What if Eleanor was not just hoarding trash? What if she was guarding something? Sloane began to tear through the cabin. She pulled down stacks of newspapers, overturned moldy mattresses, and emptied the cedar chests that smelled strongly of mothballs. Nothing. Just old clothes and rusted tools. Frustrated, she sank onto the floor near the kitchen pantry. As she hit the ground, the wood beneath her echoed with a distinct, hollow thud. Sloane paused. She knocked her knuckles against the floorboard. Solid. She moved a foot to the left and knocked again. Thud. Thud. Hollow. Her pulse quickened. She grabbed the fireplace poker, wedged the flattened iron tip into the seam between the heavy oak floorboards, and threw her entire body weight backward. The rusted nails screamed as the wood splintered and gave way. Sloane clawed at the loose board, ignoring the splinters tearing into her cuticles, and hauled it aside. Beneath the floor was a dark square cavity lined with crumbling brick. Resting in the center of the dust and cobwebs was a massive military-style metal lockbox wrapped tightly in thick, waterproof oilcloth. It was incredibly heavy. Sloane had to use both arms and her back to haul it up onto the cabin floor. The box had a heavy brass padlock, but the latch was rusted through. Sloane brought the iron poker down on the padlock twice. On the second strike, the brass shattered. She threw open the lid. It was not filled with cash as a desperate part of her had hoped. Instead, the box was packed to the brim with yellowed leather ledgers, rolled-up geological topographical maps covered in faded red ink, and stacks of vintage stock certificates bearing the name the Sterling Creek Silver Company. But resting on top of the documents was a heavy, tarnished iron key attached to a leather tag. Sloane picked it up. Faded black ink on the tag read simply, "The Root Cellar." They never found the main vein, Sloane, but I did. Sloane stared at her grandmother's handwriting. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran violently down her spine. Eleanor had not just been living on a worthless mountain. She had been sitting directly on top of a secret empire. Sloane sat back on her heels, the tarnished iron key pressing a cold, hard circle into the palm of her hand. The air in the cabin was still freezing, but she was suddenly sweating. She looked over her shoulder at Finn, who was happily tracing patterns in the dust on the windowsill, completely oblivious to the earthquake that had just fractured their reality. She turned her attention back to the lockbox. Carefully, as if handling fragile glass, Sloane unrolled the topographical map. It was a detailed survey of Oak Haven Ridge. Red ink lines snaked across the elevation markers, converging on a single spot about 50 yards directly behind the cabin. Beside the red X, in her grandmother's distinct, looping handwriting, was the word cellar. Sloane remembered Prescott's urgent, predatory tone. Mineral rights. She grabbed her late husband's heavy canvas jacket, bundled Finn into his coat, and grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight she kept in the Honda Civic's emergency kit. "Come on, Finn. We are going on a treasure hunt." They trudged through the thick, freezing mud and overgrown briars behind the cabin. The forest canopy was dense here, blocking out the pale afternoon sun. Sloane followed the topography of the map, counting her paces. 50 yards out, she hit a wall of impenetrable, thorny brush pressed against a rocky embankment. "Stand back, sweetie," Sloane murmured. She used the iron fireplace poker to hack and beat away the dead vines. After minutes of exhausting work, the iron poker struck something solid with a dull, metallic clang. Sloane dropped to her knees, tearing away the rotting vegetation with her bare, bleeding hands. Hidden beneath decades of moss and earth was a heavy steel bulkhead door slanted into the side of the mountain. It looked like the entrance to an old storm shelter, but it was chained shut with a massive, heavy-duty padlock. Sloane inserted the tarnished iron key. It slid in perfectly. With a sharp twist and a harsh screech of neglected tumblers, the lock popped open. Hauling the heavy steel door upward required every ounce of Sloane's strength. When it finally slammed back against the rocks, a rush of stale, incredibly cold air swept over them, smelling of wet stone and deep earth. Sloane flicked on the flashlight. A set of steep concrete stairs vanished down into absolute darkness. "Stay right here on the top step, Finn," Sloane commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Do not move." Sloane gripped the poker and descended into the abyss. The stairs ended in a sprawling, cavernous room, entirely reinforced with thick timber beams. It was not a root cellar for canning vegetables. It was the entrance to a mine shaft. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling wooden crates, mostly stamped with faded military surplus logos. Sloane walked over to the nearest crate. The lid was loose. She slid it off and shined her flashlight inside. The beam reflected off hundreds of jagged, heavy rocks. But these were not ordinary stones. They were dark, dense, and threaded with thick, brilliant veins of pure, glittering silver. Acanthite and native silver wire. Sloane picked one up. It was staggeringly heavy. The entire room, dozens of crates, was filled to the brim with raw, unrefined silver ore. Her breath plumed in the cold air. She walked toward the back of the cavern, where a small wooden desk sat covered in dust. On it rested a leather-bound journal. Sloane wiped away the grime and opened the cover. The handwriting inside was jagged and masculine. Property of Elias Hargrove. Sloane began to read, her eyes scanning the frantic, desperate entries. The truth of her grandfather's death unspooled in the yellowed pages. Elias had not died in a random, tragic cave-in. He had discovered the largest native silver deposit in the Blue Ridge Mountains. When he refused to sell his claim to a larger corporate mining syndicate, their lead prospector, a man named Harlan Prescott, had deliberately sabotaged the timber supports in the main tunnel while Elias was inside. Elias had survived the initial collapse long enough to write these entries, map the vein, and drag a massive amount of ore into this antechamber before succumbing to his injuries. Eleanor had found him too late. Knowing she could not prove the murder against a powerful corporation, Eleanor had sealed the mine, played the part of a crazy, impoverished hermit, and spent the next decades fiercely guarding the land, terrifying anyone who came near. Harlan Prescott, Damian Prescott's father. Sloane slammed the journal shut. The Blue Ridge Preservation Trust was a shell company. Damian Prescott knew exactly what was under this mountain. He had monitored Eleanor's status for decades, waiting for the crazy old woman to die so he could swoop in, buy the worthless land from an uneducated heir for pennies, and finally claim the billions in silver his father had murdered for. A sudden, terrifying realization hit her. Damian Prescott would not wait. A man willing to cover up a murder would not leave millions of dollars to chance, especially when an unpredictable wildcard like Sloane was sitting right on top of it. "Mom!" Finn's panicked voice echoed down the concrete stairs. "Mom, there are cars coming!" Sloane sprinted up the stairs, grabbing Finn and slamming the heavy steel bulkhead door shut behind her. She did not bother locking it. The padlock was too rusted to secure quickly. She scooped her son into her arms and ran back toward the cabin, ignoring the briars tearing at her jeans. By the time they reached the back porch, dusk had completely fallen. painting the mountain in deep, inky shadows. Two sets of blinding headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the rotting wood of the cabin. Prescott's Escalade was back, but this time it was accompanied by a heavy-duty pickup truck. 3 men stepped out into the freezing mud. Prescott was flanked by 2 large, rugged men carrying crowbars and a heavy red gasoline canister. They were not here to negotiate. They were here to erase the problem. A tragic cabin fire that claimed the lives of a homeless mother and her son would solve everything. Sloane rushed inside, locking the flimsy back door. She ran to the lockbox, shoving the maps, the ledgers, and Elias's journal into her canvas tote bag. She grabbed 2 massive chunks of the silver ore, dropping them into the bag for indisputable proof. "Finn, get under the bed in the back room and cover your ears," Sloane whispered fiercely, pressing a kiss to his forehead. She turned off the flashlight and stood in the shadows near the front window. "Mrs. Simmons?" Prescott's voice rang out, devoid of any southern charm. It was cold and commanding. "I know you are in there. I am not a patient man. The deal has changed. You sign the deed over to me right now, and I will give you $5,000 to drive away. If you do not, I cannot guarantee the structural integrity of this old firewood." One of the thugs sloshed gasoline against the side of the wooden porch. The sharp, noxious fumes drifted through the cracked window panes. Sloane's heart pounded, but the overwhelming panic she had felt in the Walmart parking lot was entirely gone. She was not a victim anymore. She was a mother backed into a corner, standing on her family's stolen empire. She opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch, holding the heavy iron fireplace poker at her side. Prescott smirked, holding a silver Zippo lighter. "Smart choice, Sloane. Where are the papers?" "I do not have them," Sloane said, her voice eerily calm, carrying over the whistling mountain wind. "But I do have Elias's journal." Prescott's smirk vanished instantly. The lighter in his hand snapped shut. "I know what Harlan did," Sloane continued, stepping forward, her eyes locked onto Prescott's. "I know about the Sterling Creek Silver Company. I know about the sabotaged beams, and I know exactly what is sitting in the root cellar 50 yards behind this cabin." The 2 thugs looked confused, glancing at their boss. Prescott's face paled, then twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. "You stupid woman," Prescott hissed. "You have no idea who you are dealing with. Do you really think anyone is going to believe a homeless vagrant over me? Burn it!" He signaled his men. The man with the gasoline stepped forward, raising his crowbar. Sloane did not flinch. She reached into a coat pocket and pulled out her cell phone. The screen was glowing brightly. "You are right, Damien. We are in a dead zone up here." Sloane lied smoothly, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "But the Civic has a satellite GPS emergency beacon, and before I stepped onto this porch, I used the 1 bar of signal I got near the window to email photographs of Elias's journal, the topographical maps, and a video of the raw silver to the district attorney in Asheville and to Special Agent Marcus Reed at the FBI field office." Prescott froze. "If this cabin burns," Sloane said, gripping the iron poker with white knuckles, "if my son and I do not drive down this mountain in the next few minutes, every news station in North Carolina is going to know that Damien Prescott's fortune is built on a buried miner and stolen land. You will spend the rest of your life in a federal penitentiary." It was a massive bluff. She had no signal. She had not sent anything. But the sheer unflinching confidence in her eyes made Prescott hesitate. Corporate criminals were cowards at heart. They feared exposure more than anything. "You are lying," Prescott spat, though he took a half step back. "Try me," Sloane challenged, raising the iron poker. "Light the match, Damien. Let us see how much you love your legacy." The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the wind. Prescott stared at her, calculating the risk. He looked at the glowing phone screen, then at the fierce, unyielding woman standing before him. He was not a killer himself. He was a suit who hired thugs. The risk of the FBI already having the documents was too high. "Get in the truck!" Prescott barked at his men, his voice shaking with suppressed fury. He pointed a trembling finger at Sloane. "This is not over." "It is for you," Sloane replied coldly. She stood frozen on the porch as the men backed away, climbed into their vehicles, and sped recklessly down the muddy mountain road, their taillights disappearing into the dark. The moment they were gone, Sloane's knees buckled. She gasped for air, tears of pure adrenaline spilling down her cheeks. She ran inside, grabbed Finn, practically threw him into the Honda Civic, and sped down the mountain in the opposite direction, toward the lights of Asheville. She did not stop until she pulled into the brightly lit parking lot of the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office, demanding to speak to the highest-ranking officer and the FBI. The aftermath was a media firestorm. When federal investigators cracked open the root cellar, they found exactly what Sloane had promised. The geological surveys confirmed a massive unmined vein of native silver extending deep into the bedrock of Oak Haven Ridge. Furthermore, the forensic analysis of Elias's journal provided enough probable cause to audit Damian Prescott's corporation, uncovering decades of bribery, land theft, and extortion. Prescott was indicted on federal racketeering and fraud charges weeks later. Sloane did not sell the land. Instead, she leased the deep mining rights to a highly regulated, environmentally conscious firm, keeping the surface acres entirely untouched. The initial lease and the extracted ore from the cellar made Sloane a multi-millionaire overnight. Later, the rusting Ford and the mountain of junk were gone. In their place stood a beautiful, custom-built log home with sprawling windows overlooking the valley. Sloane stood on the wraparound deck, sipping hot coffee, watching Finn run across the manicured lawn with a golden retriever puppy. She touched the silver pendant around her neck, cast from the very first rock she pulled from the cellar. She had arrived on this mountain, broken and desperate, but thanks to the fierce, hidden love of a grandmother she barely knew, she had finally found her home. If this story of Sloane's incredible courage and her grandmother's hidden legacy kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Do not forget to share this amazing true story with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable tales of hidden treasures, shocking twists, and everyday people fighting back against the odds. Leave a comment below. What would you do with a silver mine?